Alright everyone, we have to discuss liberals, so-called, and conservatives, so-called. There's really no meaning to either of these terms today. A lot of people who they say they're liberal, they're pro-corporate, they're pro-war, they're just democratic partisans. They don't understand the difference between party and ideology. A lot of Republicans, they're basically the same way. They're like, yes, I'm a conservative. Yeah, let's lower the tax rate 1%. That's fiscal conservatism after steadily having taxes mount up and regulations mount up for so many decades. Yeah, scaling it back by like 2 years of government overreach is actually going to solve the problem. That's not fiscal conservatism. Moral conservatives, it'd be the same way. Oh yeah, I happen to disagree with this moral ill, but don't want to do anything about it. That's actually more libertarian, by the way, in some ways. But I can remember back when people who self-proclaim themselves to be liberal individuals. They said, oh, I'm leftist, I'm a liberal, Democrat even, within the partisan sense. I can remember when they didn't quite understand why conservatives got upset at things. Like back in the 90s, we're talking the Gen X times. You have a bunch of people who claim to be conservative or moralist, religious, Republican, right-wing, whatever you want to term them. And they call, of course, the self-proclaimed liberals pinkos or commies or socialists. So bleeding heart, various terms were used back in the 90s. And they had a problem with certain things in society. One of these things was anyone who practiced a religion other than Christianity or Judaism. The specter of Islam hadn't really entered the West at the time, or at least the United States, a little bit in Europe, that's about all. And so nobody really cared to have that conversation until after 9/11. But if you were not a Christian or a Jew, they didn't really like the way you did business. Atheism was the main target, Wiccans and Satanists second, and pagans certainly third. And all of these other groups were just seen as sort of interesting, exotic, folkish practices from the savage world or something like that. And meanwhile, they went after violent video games. They went after sort of the early wave of pop culture style rap music, that is hip-hop. Certainly rock and roll was a constant target through the 80s and the 90s. Oh, these kids, they don't know anything, and, it's terrible. They're talking about using marijuana. They're talking about premarital sex or something like that, or rising up against the state. It's a big problem in our society. And they saw all of these societal ills, and they got either very disturbed by them, they were either offended, or they thought that it should be banned outright. They thought it was a moral ill on a totally different level than just offensive. I can remember when the self-proclaimed liberals or leftists or whatever you have it were the ones that didn't understand why that was going on. They're like, why are you so offended? Just turn the fucking radio station to something else. Go listen to the golden oldies if you're getting offended at, some of the stuff that was billed as offensive at the time, like garbage or something like that. Latter-day Billy Idol. Now, though, things have flipped around. So that people who claim that they're anti-left, they're on the right spectrum somewhere, libertarian, alt-right, some sort of paleocon movement, constitutionalism. The alt-right, we're talking people who are basically rudimentary populists. Now, they're the ones that are saying, no, we shouldn't censor anything. If you're offended, just, buck up, basically. And people on the left, so-called democratic partisans, corporate neoliberals certainly are the foremost of this. They're the ones that get offended at everything. Now, what they've chosen to be offended by is totally different. You see, the similarity is there. You can make whatever so-called objective moral arguments you want on these topics. But the consensus of American reality that the right held back in the 80s and the 90s is the same thing as the moral equivalent today that is held by the left. That is, the societal establishment, the consensus ideals of society now are under attack by people who in many cases are younger, in almost every case are more tech literate, and who seek to overthrow the current establishment because they don't feel that it's working. It is exactly the same as yesteryear. It's also the same as the hippie movement. When Paul Joseph Watson says the new right or the new hippies, or the alt-right or the new hippies, or whatever, He is partially right. He's also overlooking other similar. It's basically a generational thing. Each generation, in turn, overthrows the trappings of the prior generation. This has been going on for a very long time, but we look at the 20s. We look at flapper culture and, oh, women showing their knees, smoking cigarettes, young people driving a little bit too fast on the road. And we say, well, that's tame by comparison. You hear the music from back then. There's the occasional, like, vague sexual reference, some references to topical, alcohol use or something. That's really all you get. But that was considered morally outrageous back then. The fact that flappers, women, they would cut their hair short. Oh my God, they showed their ankles. Now, it was very Puritan at the time. The youth in the roaring 20s and into the early 30s overthrows that paradigm in favor of their culture. Conservatism comes back in, of a sort, of a brand. Late pre-atomic era. Overthrows that paradigm with the subsequent generation. The next generation, what is now people who fought in like World War II, the Great Generation, they overthrow that paradigm too, sort of go back to the swell ways. The subsequent, the boomer generation, become hippies, anti-war sentiment, maybe more drug use than prior generations, different types of drugs, I would say. But don't let them fool you. Your great-grandparents were probably huffing glue and getting wasted. They had some wild parties. Those old flapper parties from the 20s probably wilder than anything you see on a college campus today. They were having literal orgies on a regular basis. Had no problem with it, thought it was great. But they overthrow that paradigm. Gen X comes along. The boomers start cooling off, become a bunch of yuppies, the children of the Second World War. They become more morally conservative in many ways. Gen X comes along with the MTV stuff and Jackass and all of these bands. They have the grunge rock and punk, and they overthrow that paradigm. Now they're settling in and building the new consensus, the new establishment consensus of the oldest millennials through the youngest boomers, that general period of time, is now currently being overthrown by younger millennials and Gen Z. As well as some of us who aren't, I'm not from Generation Z, I'm almost 30 years old. I want to overthrow that consensus establishment too because it doesn't work. And so that's really what's happening here. And I can remember, and this shows the generational change. The last time around, the paradigm was being overthrown by the left. They were saying, no, why should we consider ourselves Jesus Nation on a shining hill? Why should we be intolerant towards one group or another group? And we need criminal justice reform. We're kind of tired of these wars and so forth. That begins to wane. Obama is really the symbol of the end of the last paradigm. Because here you have the ultimate symbol of everything that particular paradigm stood for in wanting to overthrow the prior paradigm, which is here's a younger, black individual, quite liberal, admits he smoked weed, the perfect symbol of the sort of corporatized version of the overthrow of the corporate sort of establishment that already existed. Now, every time that this happens, and here's a little prediction for the next decade or so, the movements that spring up with each new generation or each new generational shift, and it crosses generations as far as they're delineated by, those who actually make the terms up. So younger millennials, kind of, in a moral sense, probably closer to Generation Z than they are to older millennials. Young Gen X, the same would be true for the past era and so forth, so on back. What's going to happen is that the old paradigm, the sort of Obama paradigm that's been cheapened, that's become boring because it got cheapened and co-opted by people who ultimately, they're corporatists, they're bankers, whatever. They inject that sort of imagery into Hollywood. That's beginning to die out. You can see it right now. Look at the Ghostbusters flop. They try to take something from a past generation, overhaul it for their new sort of social and moral standards. It doesn't work. It flops. It'll never happen again. The Wonder Woman aside, this is what happens. And at the end of each generational shift, as the old paradigm solidifies into the new establishment and the new generation immediately begins looking for ways to overhaul it, there's always chaos. I look forward to it. I look forward to Generation Z getting a little bit older into their college years, the older ones, and completely messing with the establishment that exists today. Oh, I look forward to, I can't wait to see that youth rebellion unleashed, because for the first time, this is important, for the first time, the new paradigm will be fed by social media and by an instantly connected world that is voluntarily, in essence, globalistic. That is, on the internet, you can talk to people from around the world. Consensuses can be built outside of national borders. I oppose globalism in the involuntary sense. This is an important differentiation, I think, that many people, people on the alt-right really need to make this argument. There's a difference between government decides you're going to lose your borders, lose your sovereignty, and bow before foreign entities. There's a big difference between that and people simply getting together, being peaceful, and having their conversations in an online, very voluntary form because they choose to. They find it interesting. It's intellectually stimulating. I think that's going to play a big role in the upcoming paradigm shift. If I had to guess, I would say, based on my observations of human history, Generation Z, in certain social senses, will be even more permissive than millennials are, generally speaking, as an aggregate. In other ways, though, they will go back towards the hard right, even into a neo-nationalist sort of movement. And in many ways, I expect them to be quite fiscally conservative. They're already beginning to make comparisons between the way money is spent by the older Gen Z and by many millennials. Millennials, because they were born in times, raised up in childhood, in the 90s, early 2000s, when economic times were good, don't generally understand the value of saving, think that, the stereotype is want to be handed everything on a golden platter. But that's what they were told was going to happen to them throughout their entire childhood. I know, in my case, even though I was born into the lower class, the general consensus idea was if you are smart enough to go to college, or even you skilled enough to go into a trade school, you're set. You'll be fine. It'll be like the baby boomers had it. You'll be fine because things are stable and wealthy. There's peace. Cold War is over. And that didn't pan out. Cold War's back. Never technically left. The banks began to collapse. Recession. Massive job losses. You look now. If you look at all the apologists for the Obamaites, they're saying, oh, there are a record number of jobs available. Why aren't the millennials taking these jobs despite record unemployment among millennials? It's because most of those jobs you can't make ends meet with. You'd have to work at 2 of them. You do realize you'd be working 70, 80 hours a week. Many people can't keep up that schedule. They've got other arrangements too, because a lot of them have stayed at home, beginning to take care of their older boomer parents or something. They can't have an 80-hour-a-week job. They will be locked into perpetual poverty. Generation Z, though, has one advantage. Although you didn't get to live your early life in a nice, peaceful, wealthy, prosperous, ever optimistic sort of 90s atmosphere, in which the worst angst you had was which band was better and which skateboard are you going to ride. Going to live in the burbs, man, we can go to San Diego, something like that. Because of that, you will actually know the value of working hard and innovating, which is probably a huge advantage over most of my fellow millennials. No disrespect, we did get screwed, in all honesty. Right when I was going into college is right when the recession began. It was within months. It wasn't even within years, it was months. I'm like, yeah, if I get some debt, it's not going to be a big problem, because if I do a halfway decent job, I can at least get, something that would be roughly lower middle class. I can make ends meet. I can have my little house, or rent a home, have a nice apartment. Everything will go fine. Then everything is shaken to the core of its foundation. I'm like, whoops, there goes my plans. It sort of felt like when I was in elementary school. When I got to 6th grade in the new school that I was going to, it was the first year they didn't allow kids to throw snowballs in the playground. I felt so discouraged by that. I'm like, it's snowing all the time. Why can't I throw snowballs at people? It's not like I'm putting rocks in them and trying to bean people in the head and knock an eye out or something. I felt screwed, honestly, and I felt screwed again. I'm glad I dropped out of college. I'm glad that I went into doing my own work. It's much more stable, brings in a lot more money. And then also, I get to communicate with people who are less retarded than a lot of the people that I had to go to college with. Now, I went to UVM. So everyone there's like hippie trippy. A lot of them were like, West Coast trust funders and bullshit like that. They were on their parents' credit cards and had their trust funds and stuff and came to pretend to be hippies. To pretend to rough it. Oh yeah, I love these Green Mountains. Look at me, I listen to Fish, or something like that. And it was just, you could tell who the posers were. It was so obvious. I don't know anything about Vermont culture. I think that UVM is Vermont, or that downtown Burlington is Vermont. Downtown Burlington, half the people you see are tourists anyway. But yes, I can remember back when it was the left that didn't understand why are people so offended. Yeah, you don't have to listen to this radio broadcast you find offensive. You don't have to consume the CDs of these grunge bands. You don't have to do X, Y, and Z. If you don't like this person who's speaking out against Christianity, just don't listen to them. Now the left has done a 180 and it's doing exactly the opposite. More evidence, again, of that paradigm shift. It's in US politics, it's in society, it's on the internet, it's everywhere. Can't you feel there's a different breeze in the air right now? It feels pretty good compared to the last one. The last one started getting a little fucking stagnant after a while. But for the next 10 to 15 years at least, our future is assured. Oh, I feel optimistic about the coming generation. I feel fucking great, honestly. That's about all. Peace out.